All right, come on in, everybody. I have a special treat for you today. Constance Hunter is the chief economist at Economist Enterprise, and that is a very, very big deal. Yeah, many of you know the Economist magazine, but what you don't know is that the company has a series of really fabulous products and services that provide data and insight to businesses and government leaders around the world. And one of the one of the ones that those of us who aren't just in business, but mostly focus on policy, love is their democracy index. And for, I don't know, almost 20 years, they've been publishing a list of an analysis really of the countries around the world on a framework that measures really a continuum from autocracy to democracy. And I have been waiting for this year's, which I thought was going to be out in February, and I've been biting my nails awaiting.
We were a little late this year. we made some adjustments that changed our timing, but thank you for waiting for it.
No, I'm delighted. So here we are with Constance Hunter, and just so you know, when she's not talking to us, she's busy advising, corporate boards and government leaders on issues that really on matters of risk that matter a lot, and we're living in a very risky time. So could you start, I think, with just a little bit of an overview of the pillars that you measure in this so that people can understand what we're talking about?
Yeah, happy to. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and that was a wonderful introduction. So let me talk to you about what our 5 pillars are and sort of why our index is different from other indices. So most traditional democracy indices focus on electoral process and pluralism, civil liberties, and political participation. When we designed this index 19 years ago, added functioning of government and political culture. Those are 2 unique aspects of EIU's index that gives it a little bit more depth than some of the other indices that are out there. And it can result in us having slightly different scoring mechanisms, and it can signal early changes within regimes that can be both to the upside or the downside, but it gives us some early warning.
Yep. And as scholars of democracy talk a lot about, those people who think a democracy is just about like voting don't truly understand it. One of the problems the US had, after all, in Iraq is we went in there and said, gee, if we just hold elections, everything will be fine. Or in Egypt, we said, just hold elections, and the Brotherhood won, and that was the end of democracy for a while there. So democracies are complicated things, after all, really complicated social, cultural, political things.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we often get pushback when countries are categorized in our flawed democracy category. And actually, that is where the majority of democracies live. They live in that flawed democracy category because democracies are designed by humans, and humans were a little bit flawed. And so we do the best that we can in designing our governments, but it's not always perfect.
Yeah, and we don't always live by the design either,
and we don't always.
We are finding out here.
Well,
all right, so there's a trend here in the last decade. There's been a rising autocracy around the world, and you found something different this time. Talk about that.
So it is a nascent result. We had the overall score declining for the last 8 years, and this year the score ticked up a little bit. And so there are a couple of aspects of that to note. The first is the stability that we see in that category of full and flawed democracies. So that's 45% of the index falls into that category. And of those countries, 85% of them either saw their score remain the same or rise. Then within the lower scored countries, the hybrid regimes and the authoritarian regimes, we saw a couple of notable hybrid regimes move up and out of that category into the flawed democracy category. And that's why we're saying it looks like there might be an end to the democracy recession. Now, it's too early to say if that is, if it's a false dawn, or if we're going to see a bit of a turnaround, but it certainly we can definitively say that the index is no longer falling. And in fact, it rose slightly this year.
Mm-hmm. But you had, well, let's just get right to it. You had one huge exception.
We did have a big exception. I think probably most of your viewers can think of who that might be, and that is the United States, where we really saw a decline in civil liberties and a decline in political culture.
And a decline in functioning of government.
And a decline in, I should mention also, yes, a significant decline in functioning of government. And when I've gotten pushback on that, I point out that one of the aspects of functioning of government is having transparency in your government. Most democracies have very highly transparent processes and procedures. And not only do we have a number of agencies that have been gutted or eliminated entirely against the wishes of Congress, but we and have therefore reduced their ability to function. But we also have a big loss of transparency, and that is a problem in a democracy.
And you have a rise in corruption, which gets at functioning and other things.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Very tough. So I want to then take what's going on in the U.S. and circle back to the general rise that you found in the rest of the other countries you looked at. Because when I looked at increased political participation in Europe, for example, some of the reasons you cite for that is a reaction to what's going on in the United States.
Saw that in Europe and Canada.
Right.
Political parties really being able to galvanize the populace, and people observing what happened in the US and saying, oh, I need to increase my political participation. Now, I should say in the US, political participation has not fallen. It's actually pretty steady. And so that is not a criteria where we've seen a significant decline in the United States, but we certainly saw the actions of the U.S. spur other countries to take action.
Yeah, I mean, when I read your report, I felt like it felt like I read it and I thought, well, if the U.S. democracy falls, I think the others do too. I think there's a reaction here towards the end saying, well, no, look, we don't want to go the way they're going. We're worried about it. And we have this governing group that is running around supporting autocratic movements around the globe. J.D. Vance was just in Hungary. Hungary has been on your...
Well, and Hungary they're a flawed democracy. They're holding elections on Sunday, and it will be very interesting to see how those elections go.
Right. Elections are usually the last thing to go, right? And they are the last, what people can do. I mean, people still have that power in places. In Hungary, they probably still have that power. We'll see what happens if the votes get counted. And here we have that power. Notwithstanding any efforts to say, well, we'll federalize elections. Well, that is not a power the federal government hasn't been able to get it, even if it wanted to try it. But I was stunned, I'm going to stay with the U.S. a little bit. I was stunned that you were as clear as you were about the efforts of the administration to undermine democracy. I mean, you just laid them out there. There wasn't any pulling any punches.
We don't pull punches. That's part of our brand.
Yeah.
We call it like we see it, and it's fact-based, it's evidence-based. Now, one thing that is happening in the U.S. Is that we are seeing things happen in the courts, and that part of our civil liberties is working, right? So while there was a decline, we do see the courts working. And we see that there's pushback. That is just not a straight line, however. It is a jagged road, and it will take time for that check and balance to come into place to put some governance on the executive branch of government.
Yeah. I read that too, and I thought, in fact, what you said was, as long as the courts hold, we'll be okay. So that tells me, A, that there is a concerted attempt to make sure we're not okay, and they have to do their job, which I thought was brave of you to say. The other question it raises is whether the courts, even if they hold, remain relevant. We have a story just this week that courts ruled that the Defense Department violated their orders about allowing journalists into the Pentagon.
Yeah.
So the executive branch has to still obey court orders for the courts to be relevant.
Well, and I think the body politic has to be aware and push back on that at the appropriate time when we go to the polls.
Yep. Yeah. So you focused on the court's holding, which I think was absolutely appropriate. You didn't spend as much time talking about the role of the public in the report, but as you just mentioned, the last line of defense is the people, and we still count votes, that is how you redress. This is how Hungary redresses. This is how Poland actually redressed it a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I want to get to other parts of the world. I'm going to circle back to the U.S., but there's so much interesting stuff here. Like, what's going on? I mean, Africa is the youngest continent on the planet.
It is. And it is a continent that is going to have the largest year-over-year increase in its working population for the next 30 years.
Right. So what happens there is enormously important for the world. So what's the democracy story in Africa?
Well, it's not great. And the majority of countries are either authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes. But I mentioned that there were several countries that elevated themselves from hybrid regime to flawed democracy. Two of those are Malawi and Senegal. Mm-hmm. So that is very encouraging. In addition, we saw in Kenya youth movements that really impacted the outcome in elections. And so I think when you look at a continent that young and you think about the potential youth participation, it is potentially very encouraging. On the other hand, without systems in place, so you mentioned this early on, right? We went to Iraq, we said, we'll hold elections, everything will be fine. You really need governance structures in place. So if you have that political participation without governance, that is combustible, and that can also lead to significant instability.
Yeah, and I mean, among those, I'm going to go back to the functioning of government as one of those things you need. You can't have people trust their government if everyone in government says we're going to move the train to the left and it never gets out of the station. Mm-hmm. Right? And people begin to be like, well, that's not doing what it's supposed to do. And we've had some of that in America. People feeling like whatever party's in power, it hasn't done the job. And you guys wrote about this a year ago in your report last year that just when people feel like their government isn't doing what everybody who goes into government promises, they stop having faith in the government.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And the other thing that you find in surveys is that in some respects, people don't want their government officials to be fighting and arguing all the time. They do want them to find that solution that gets legislation passed and that, as you said, moves the train down the tracks.
Yeah. So in parts of the world where the government is less functional, even the highest aspirations of these youth movements, they frequently end up in frustration.
Sure. And I mean, the Arab Spring would be a perfect example of that.
Yep.
When that happened, there was a lot of optimism that we were going to see greater representation for people in those countries, and that really has not materialized significantly.
Right. And I think, was it Nepal just recently, the youth movement ended a government that was corrupt and autocratic, but we're not sure yet what will be in its place.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be an uphill battle again because of these other scores, whether it's civil liberties or democratic political culture, functioning of government, but it's very hard to make progress without those things. On the other hand, what we've observed is that they can come later, right? So if you have political participation and if you have elections, right, those two things can help bring about changes in the other factors of government. It's just very difficult to do, which is why we don't see a lot of movement from the lower categoried regimes into full and flawed democracies.
You had, I mean, your work, you found in studying some of the relationships of the of these factors to bigger patterns of democracy, that they all rise, and you can, if you work on all of them, you can build a democracy. But if you sink one of them, it tends to bring them all down, which means the momentum for democracies really runs negatively. It requires constant work.
That is that is exactly the point. Yes, the momentum runs negative.
Yeah, and I think that particularly here in the oldest democracy, where we've grown complacent about its always being here. And I'm in Washington today. I just got here before we started our call. You know, you fly in and you see these amazing monuments to American democracy, and you think, well, that'll always be here. But your work around the world is proof about how fragile these are, and how if you gnaw away at one of these elements at it, and that can be a free press, it can be civil rights. If you start down any of those roads, it impairs the whole fabric.
Well, yes, and the thing that is most vulnerable is based on our work, and the thing that has been degraded the most is civil liberties. Now, some of that had to do with the pandemic. Governments put restrictions on people because the trade-off was versus a global pandemic. And interestingly enough, if you go back throughout history, and you can go all the way back to the plague of Athens, government structures and democracies have suffered after plagues and pandemics. And the fall of Athens occurred after the plague of Athens, which lasted 5 years. Now, the plague of Athens came right on the heels of the Peloponnesian War. So it's hard to say that that was the definitive cause of the fall of democracy in Greece at that time, but it certainly was a significant contributor. And so the world is also feeling the impact, and I would say the long tail of the pandemic in some of this scoring.
I'm fighting the urge to get very nerdy about ancient Athens with you, because Thucydides is one of my favorites. And
likewise,
I've learned a lot from him. So that plague and what was going on in Athens led them also to some bizarre military adventurism, right? They weren't just fighting the neighbor Sparta. They went, oh, gee whiz, we can conquer Syracuse. And that was an enormous disaster for them. Sort of like saying we can conquer Iran. I mean, you know, you have to be very careful, and they go together, and can be very corrosive to Democrat. But their democracy was weaker than ours to begin with. They didn't have, not only was it not full, but it didn't have many of the things that protect our democracy.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't stress this enough. Our courts really are the
hugely important.
Yeah, and look, we see this around the world. We see this in other countries. Brazil would be a great example.
Yes,
that court system really helped up the democracy.
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice though to have an ostracon? Oh, I'd love to have that vote today in the United States.
Well,
I don't want to put you in that position. I'm sorry. So another thing that you talked about in countries was polarization. I mean, it's a great impact here and in Europe. And I want to ask you about that, because I look here, and I guess in Europe, but mostly here, and I'm not sure what I see is fair to characterize as polarization. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this. It feels to me like one group of America got radicalized, because if you look at American presidents over time, you look at Democratic presidents, there is just not that huge a difference. You can see it going step by step from, I don't know, from JFK to Joe Biden. It's just not, they're not that different. But if you look at Republican presidents, from Nixon to Reagan, completely different. From Reagan to W, completely different. From W to Trump, not even recognizable, right? So there's a radicalization on America's right, I think. And I see certainly evolution on the left. Things like gay rights were nowhere before. But I don't see the same kind of radical change that I see on the right. And I wonder if that's a different way of looking at it, and if it's a fair way.
I'd have to give that some more thought, but what I can say is that we know that there are actors around the world who are states that are not necessarily friendly to the US, Iran, Russia, North Korea, that actively engage in disinformation campaigns that cause destabilization and mistrust in institutions.
Mm-hmm.
That is very much a fertile ground once you've stirred that up for increased polarization, or as you say, radicalization.
Yeah.
Another feature, if we look just again around the world, religion and radicalization are very often co-linked. And so we certainly have seen a rise of the religious right in the US, and certain politicians on the right favoring less separation of church and state. And so I think when you put all those factors together, right, we're looking at a world where it is going to be increasingly important for democracies to think about where's that fine line between having multiple views and really having a diverse set of opinions and diverse set of possibilities where people can be represented versus that polarization and radicalization.
Yes, completely. I would say if we cannot be a nation as big as we are and have everybody think the same thing. And oh, how boring a country that would be, right? To have 350 million people all think the same thing. We want to have different points of view, but we want to have a political system that allows us to have those different points of view and mediates those differences peacefully so that we can work together on our future. That's the promise of democracy, after all. It's countries that are autocracies. It says, no, the truth comes from the boss, period.
Well, yes, and I think this is where a free press is really critical towards getting at that truth. And obviously laws that ensure that the press is reporting facts. We have a lot of news that is really opinion-based and less fact-based, and that's much more entertaining. We can understand why people gravitate towards that. But if we think about the media landscape and all of the different channels of media, so a podcast is a channel that didn't exist 20 years ago. And then we have social media, and then we have cable news.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ways that people get so-called information is varied and not verified.
Most of it comes this way these days, through a phone.
Sorry?
Most of it comes through a phone, right?
100%.
Right. But here in the U.S., unlike everywhere else, with the guarantees of free speech, we are not ever going to be able to tell the press, you must report the facts. We're never going to be able to tell them, you can't lie. I mean, they can't do it with malicious intent. There is a line there, but it's a very hard line to get across. So what we need from our population is some fabulous media literacy to be able to see. And I am proud of Americans, Constance. I think you look at polling, it's taken a while, but people see they can find the truth if they want to look for it. And, mostly we're busy. We have other things to do. But people are figuring it out. And maybe we're more media literate than people give us credit for, after we are certainly the most marketed to crowd on the planet. You turn on your TV and somebody's trying to sell you a drug. You can't do that anywhere else in the world. So I think people are capable of taking in all of the nonsense and filtering at least some of it. Not everybody, for sure, but that's what we cobble majorities together from.
Well, and you also bring up the issue of busyness, right? I mean, if you're raising a family and holding down a job and, trying to put food on the table, that, can take up a great deal of time. In fact, 100% of your time. And so certainly having, the degradation of regulations, which insisted on fairness in reporting, I think has had an impact on the availability of what people consume.
Yes,
And I
the
think,
fairness doctrine was a
you
problem.
know, think about when I was growing up, we watched the nightly news, and people had preferences. Did they like CBS or NBC or ABC? But you pretty much, they were distinguishable by their hosts to some extent, but they reported the same information.
They did.
Right now, we're in a situation where there are so many different pieces of information being reported across the spectrum, some of which is not information, some of which is
It's a
outright
huge,
falsehood.
I agree with you, it's a huge challenge. And yet, back in the day when we had Walter Cronkite tell us, and that's the way it is, huge chunks of America, the stories that were relevant to them never got told to anybody.
Well, that's a fair point.
Right. So we're in a very strange time that we don't yet know how to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
It has pluses and minuses, and cagey politicians have learned how to take advantage of the minuses and the pluses. Hey, I want to ask you something else about the thinking that went into this year's report. And I may be way over my skis, reading it like a English professor reads a novel, but it read differently to me than past years' reports. It read like you were in a room and you said, you know what, we really need the business community to understand what's going on. It was not written for academics. It wasn't as, the essays were different, and the focus, and you spent a lot of time on this, and I thought it was fabulous and very important, was that to make the link between the risk to democracies and the increased types, both types of risk and magnitude of risk for business investments. Can you talk about that?
Sure, I would be happy to. So I think as an economist, the academic community is always very near and dear to my heart. And obviously, historically, the Democracy Index has been heavily consumed by democracy scholars, and we're very grateful for that. But ultimately, Economist Enterprise is here to provide facts, data, and insights to our B2B clients, our business to business clients.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it was you're right. We made a definite concerted effort to tilt the report in a direction that would be relevant and read by that audience, and to link it to really, operational business risks that are relevant to people either marketing to those countries or putting actual foreign direct investment into those economies.
Yeah, I mean, talk a little bit in more depth about those risks. I mean, you talked about, you lose a little bit of freedom over the choices you make. There's more dispersion. There's, the interference might be greater. Like, if you were talking to a board about this, how would you describe the increased challenges as the democracy scores go down?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, rule of law can be more arbitrary. If you're operating in a country that has low civil liberties scores, for example, odds are if you need to adjudicate a matter in court, the probability that you get a fair and impartial ruling that is not based on the flag that you carry is reduced. So that's a really important thing for businesses operating in a country. Democracies tend to, on balance, have lower what we call Gini coefficients. So that's the spread between the wealthiest and the poorest. And so if you're marketing directly to the consumer, right, you want a consumer that has that ability to consume. That's going to be more likely in democracies. So all of these factors, I mean, we could spend the entire rest of the show unpacking that, and in future democracy indices we anticipate going into more detail on this, but these are really highly correlated items, and there is a high causal relationship as well.
So I was thrilled to see that.
Thank
I
you.
was thrilled to see it forgive me, not from the perspective of, oh, here's the economist who finally really understands who their audience, paid audience is, and is making a product of it, but because I think it's, for a democracy advocate like me, I thought it was an enormously effective use of your resources this year to
Well,
focus on that, because they have not been in the game. All these business leaders have, again, I think they have other things on their minds, and they have not paid as much attention to what's going on and how it affects them in the same way. Or they have with a more short-term focus.
I mean, I think there are a couple of groups that I've been involved with over the last several years, where business leaders do recognize, though, that if you have a workforce or a customer base that is highly polarized, right, it makes your operating environment much more challenging. So there are dimensions on which I think business leaders are aware of the challenges of having less functioning democracies or hybrid regimes or authoritarian regimes.
Right. But now that you have put a document together that they're going to want to read, they're going to see how the pieces fit better and how they can think more clearly about what they can and need to do. So, as a democracy advocate,
of our job, connect the dots for people, and to bring to light data and information that might not always be in front of their face.
Yep. All right. Well, I know your time is short, so I'm so grateful that you spent some of it with us today, and the report was worth waiting for.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so grateful that you had me on the show, and really appreciate your feedback and your support.
No, it's great work you do. No, the whole company does. The magazine's great. The data is great. The insights are worthwhile. Even when you don't agree with it, it's a big challenge to figure out why. So, as it should be.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.